evening, everyone. I'm Paul Samson, President of the Centre for International Governance Innovation. A real pleasure to be here tonight, CIGI, amongst friends, as we call ourselves. We are here tonight to honor the great Canadian diplomat, thinker, organizer, and teacher, John Wendell Holmes. Welcome to everyone online and those here in person. It's nice to see people. To begin, I would like to acknowledge that we are here on the traditional territory of the Atwandrayan, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee peoples. The Centre for International Governance Innovation is situated on the Halamand Tract, the land promised to the Six Nations that includes 10 kilometers on each side of the Grand River. If you are watching via Zoom, you can ask questions via the Q&A tool at any point in the event, and those questions will be compiled and sent to Shull, who's a managing director at CIGI and who will be moderating the discussion to follow. If you are watching on live stream on social media, you want to ask a question, you will need to register for the event, and you can find that on the event page at cgonline.org in order to get the Zoom link. Those of you that are in the room will have an opportunity to ask questions from the microphones on either side of the auditorium, so I hope that's clear. The essay series, which we just heard about, Situating Canada in a Changing World, is at the heart of the event today, and that is also available online for those attending in person. We have printed copies available here that we'll make to you free of charge at the registration table outside. So I'm going to move on and get to the speakers, which are the key of this evening, but it's my pleasure to introduce the first speaker here this evening, Charles Beer. And he has the kind of CV that is very hard to do justice to, given his extraordinary experience. But in a nutshell, he is a former Ontario minister and longtime public servant, which is a very interesting combination. I have to say, those are the cream of the crop. He's been a CEO, he has been a chief of staff, a commissioner, an executive director, and the list probably goes on, for over 40 years of different leadership experience in government and not-for-profit organizations. So Charles brings extraordinary skills and experience in public policy and issues advocacy. It sounds a little bit Holmesian, I might add here, that there seems to be some common themes. So Charles Beer is here tonight with his wife, Mary Anna, and I would like to acknowledge as well that there are a number of relatives and close friends of John Holmes who are with us this evening in the audience. So with that, it's my pleasure to welcome Charles Beer to start the event tonight. Thank you, Charles.
Thank you very much, Paul, and it really is an honor and a privilege to join with everyone this evening. I, as is the case with a number of family members here, am a nephew of John Wendell Holmes. And in coming in this evening and just seeing the essays and what is being produced, I know that wherever Uncle Johnny is up there, he's looking down and he would be very, very proud of what is happening, and particularly with a series that's focused on helping Canadians better understand themselves and better understand international relations. So that is I think, a wonderful thing that this is doing. As has been mentioned, I'm delighted, too, that we can have a number of family members here, and there are many others from across the country who are watching in. And we all shared a great love and fondness for our uncle, and this evening is really important to us all. I do want, at the outset, though, to thank two people in particular, and that's Adam Chapnick and Shull. I think it is fair to say that this essay series and this evening would simply not have happened without their leadership. Adam, we really want to thank you for the wonderful biography that you wrote of Uncle Johnny, Canada's Voice, The Public Life of John W. Holmes. You set out so well and captured so well in your book the many qualities that he brought to public life and underlined clearly the significant contribution he made to Canada's civil society and our place in the world. We also thank you for your many years of stewardship of the John Holmes Trust, along with Gail Fraser, Uncle Johnny's longtime associate at the Institute, and Jane Barrett and Jennifer McNenly, who both served as librarians at the Institute. Aaron, from the beginning of our discussions of how best to honor Uncle Johnny, you and the Centre have been supportive at every turn with ideas and suggestions as to how to proceed. You have ensured that the Centre was closely involved in developing the project and ensuring a successful conclusion. We thank you, your staff, and the board of CIGI for playing such a key role in this endeavor. As many of you know, the Canadian Institute of International Affairs was home to Uncle Johnny for many, many years. When one thought of the CIIA, one thought of John Holmes. And I'm pleased, therefore, that John English, the chair of the Canadian International Council, the successor to the CIIA, is here tonight as well. I should note that John was also the first chair of the Holmes Trust, and it just seems to me it's fitting and appropriate to have the historical links of the Canadian Institute of International Affairs together with the Centre and the Council joined here this evening in this public event honoring John Wendell Holmes. And now, if you will permit, I'd like to share a few words about John W. Holmes, the uncle. He came from a very close-knit family in London, Ontario. His mother, Helen, and father, Wendell, were always very proud of his many accomplishments. He had three wonderful sisters, Helen and the identical twins, Isabel, and my mother, Elizabeth. They were strongly supportive of him and he of them, and they all remained really very, very close to the end of his life. For us nieces and nephews, and indeed for a number of great nieces and nephews, I think I can speak for everyone and say that he was a wonderful and involved uncle. And in many ways, we saw him as the quintessential uncle. Our earlier memories would be of his travels around the world to what at the time seemed like unknown and mysterious places. In the late 40s and 50s, we did not have computers, social media, or instant news. I won't mention fake news. So to know someone, a family member, who crossed the Atlantic during the Second World War, who served in the Soviet Union and at the United Nations, was unique in so many ways. And we all enjoyed the times we would visit him in Ottawa and were allowed briefly into the inner sanctum of the East Bloc, not to mention his Toronto apartment, to which we all had a key and could go and visit him whenever. When he would visit our families, he always wanted to know what we were up to. He asked us lots of questions and paid close attention to what we said. I can recall on various occasions when we, as undergraduates, would be pontificating on the future of the world. He would listen thoughtfully and then calmly, but effectively, take us back through whatever the issue was and gently open our minds to other perspectives and other points of view. Any encounter with Uncle Johnny was a learning experience and an enjoyable one. He was someone we could go to for advice and counsel, as we often did. He also had a wonderful sense of humor. He was full of what in the family we called Holmes puns that made us laugh and groan at the same time. He was famous for his Christmas quiz, which challenged everyone and their knowledge of music and plays. I don't think any of you who had him as a teacher, colleague, or mentor would be surprised by these reflections about him. He showed the same interest, respect, and courtesy to everyone. And as an aside, I have always been fascinated by the number of his former students and friends who also referred to him as Uncle Johnny. To my mind, that has always demonstrated how closely people connected with him. He was part of their family. In the last chapter of Adam's biography, he quotes a number of people who knew and worked with Uncle Johnny. Charles Ritchie said he had been a touchstone of integrity, astute judgment, and common sense. He was a man, a good man, good without dullness, tolerant of almost everything except intolerance, who set his standards high and never let a friend down. Basil Robinson called him the patient builder, the soul of integrity with the brilliant mind, the human heart, the kindly courtesies, the wonderful sense of fun, servant of his nation and the world, mentor to so many of us, and very dear friend. And finally, Keith Spicer expressed so well Uncle John's contribution to Canada. His contribution as diplomat and intellectual to Canada and to world peace was rightly assessed as seminal. Holmes wore the cap of a gentleman with such ease that for many he defined the idea of graciousness. In his discreet but brilliant way, he led 2 generations of Canadians to believe that, middle power or little power, they could make a difference in the world. They described the same person we knew and loved. John Wendell Holmes was a son, brother, surrogate father, uncle, diplomat, commentator, writer, and teacher. Fundamentally, I believe Uncle Johnny was a teacher throughout his life and in everything that he did. He wanted Canadians to think about the world and our place in it, to think carefully about complex issues, to engage in vigorous but civil discourse, to be engaged. And in his own life, he practiced what he taught. We shall always remember him, and we thank you for this evening and the essay series. Thank you. It's now my privilege to introduce Adam Chapnick. He, in many ways, doesn't need an introduction, but he, of course, is associated with the Royal Military College, where he serves as a professor and deputy director for defense studies, and also at the Canadian Forces College, where he is the director of education. We know him as one who has written and edited a number of books, the one on Uncle Johnny, but some very interesting work on Canada as a middle power, Canada and the United Nations. It speaks in various places and just has a perception on Canada and its place in the world that I'm so sorry that he never actually met Uncle Johnny. I know Uncle Johnny would have loved to have developed a close working relationship with him, and we're all delighted that he's here tonight and that he's done all the work that he has. So, Adam, if I can ask you up.
Well, thank you all for coming, and for all of you who are watching online. When CIGI and the Holmes trustees began to discuss a joint project to celebrate Mr. Holmes's legacy, we sought to produce something that was consistent with his intellectual spirit, the spirit you've already heard so much about. We had to do something that was of value to practitioners without compromising its scholarly quality. We had to do something that was useful in the classroom, but also meaningful to broader public debates. We were inspired, or at least I was inspired, by the text of the first lecture that Mr. Holmes used to give in his graduate level course at the University of Toronto. And this is what it said. Although challenges to Canadian foreign policy are constantly changing, they are also endemic and cyclical. And historical perspective is essential to a comprehension of present dilemmas. We eventually settled, as you've learned, on an essay series that paired some of the leading historians of Canadian foreign and international policy, Canadian statecraft, with contemporary yet historically inclined practitioners in an effort to examine a set of issues that we thought were critical to the country and its future. I want to quote Mr. Holmes again for you. He said that people with historic sense see the world as it is, a whirling mass of peoples and states of various shapes and sizes, and in various stages of political and economic development, quite incapable of fitting themselves for a long time into any rigid system of world order, but willing, in a rough way, to combine together to improve their lot and escape destruction. The theme of the essays to be featured this evening is enhancing Canada's security posture in an uncertain global environment. The historian, who I've got the privilege to introduce, is Professor Tim Sayle. Tim comes to us from the University of Toronto, where he's an associate professor of history and chair of the International Relations Program. His recent book on NATO, called Enduring Alliance, A History of NATO and the Post-War Global Order, is quite simply brilliant. And he is also quite possibly the most important scholar in Canada when it comes to making archival evidence about Canadian foreign policy history, defense policy history, intelligence policy history, security policy history, accessible to students, not just here, but around the world through his incredible web repository that he calls Canada Declassified. Tim's paper is simply called Canadian National Security and Historical Perspective. Tim is joined by the practitioner of the panel, who is more than just a practitioner, Laurence Deschamps-Laporte. She comes to us currently as an assistant professor of political science and a scientific director of the Montreal Centre for International Studies at l'Université de Montréal. But we knew her and wanted her here in large part because she has served up to the level of chief of staff for 3 different foreign ministers. She comes to us also with history and consulting with McKinsey, and as a Rhodes Scholar with a PhD from Oxford. Her paper today, the paper on which her comments are based, is called Deterrence of Partisanship as Canadian National Security Strategy. At this point, I hope you see that I am overwhelmed by the quality of the speakers. It's time for me to get out of the way, welcome them, and begin the discussion. Thanks so much for coming.
Thanks so much, Adam, for that kind introduction. You only left one thing out, which is that I've had great teachers, and you were one of them, so thank you very much. And so thanks to Adam, to Aaron, to CIGI, and a really special thanks to the Holmes trustees for making this essay series and this evening possible. It's a delight to be here. It's an honor, but I have to start with bad news, something of a grim list. Let me describe a world to you. One with rising powers and an international system in flux, technological change and revolutionary weapons, political unrest, even political violence south of the border, states willing to invade others to try and increase their territory, Canadians working with and fighting alongside allies around the world, maybe even a world consumed by global war. A grim list, as I said. Are these the present and future national security challenges facing Canada? Maybe, but that's not my point. This list doesn't describe Canada's future. This is Canada's past. Yes, we live in a dangerous and complicated world. Our foreign minister recently said that crises used to be something that happened every once in a decade, but now they're happening every year. And I understand this sentiment. These are frightening times. But is that right? Does historical reflection bear this out? No. In fact, this is hardly the first era in which crises have piled up at Canada's door. Canada and Canadians have navigated immense challenges in the past. And what I argue in the essay is that we should look to that past, and we should use it as one tool, among others, to consider how to confront the national security challenges facing us today and those that will face us tomorrow. And so in my short time here today, I want to remind us of the important challenges Canada has faced in the past and to make the case that this history can inform policy. Now, the first category of examples I call shifting world orders. Shifting world orders, I think, is a phrase right out of any 2022 publication by a think tank. But the world and world orders have been shifting around Canada since the very beginning. Indeed, Canada's history has only been set for a fraction in this rules-based international order. If we go back to Confederation, Canada was, of course, born in the British Empire. But it was only about three and a half decades after Confederation that the colonial secretary, Joseph Chamberlain, was warning that the imperial center, that London was in his words, weary titan, staggering under the too vast orb of its fate. And of course, that British Empire that Canada was born into would change and change dramatically in the first and second half of the 20th century, and the world order would change around it. What we must remember is that this shift in international order actually energized debate and thinking in Canada about Canada's place in this world. The interwar period, for instance, the 20s and the 30s, was a period of intellectual ferment and innovation as Canadians thought about how and why to chart an independent foreign policy in the world. Another thing in the category of shifting world orders is the rise of new powers. The rise of new powers. Well, Canada has seen this movie before. Indeed, it was playing on our very border as the strongest power in world history grew up next door. Of course, I'm talking about the rise of the United States. Something we can't forget had direct and indirect challenges to Canadian sovereignty. In fact, even as late as 1912, Theodore Roosevelt had still not given up on the idea of annexing Canada. And he was only one in a long line of American leaders who expected that Canada would, like a ripe apple, fall into the Republic's lap. Now, of course, Canada has not been annexed. And in fact, Canada and Canadians have done something quite remarkable. They have switched the protection of the British Empire to the American one, and done so in a way that maintained and maintains Canada's political independence. In sum, if we pull back and look at the history, we can see that Canadians have been remarkably agile in managing shifts in the international order. What lessons can we draw from that history for today? My next basket in the essay has to do with another fear that has stalked Canada through its history. It's this idea that economic forces will pull our country in different directions, and especially south toward the United States. Selling out Canada to the Americans was a stick used by politicians to beat each other in the elections of 1891 and 1911. The idea of trade and sovereignty have always been so closely linked. And they were linked almost 100 years later, in the 1980s, in the great debates about free trade. Now, North American free trade did come to be. Free trade has come onto the international scene in a way unpredicted a century past. And there's some evidence to suggest that economic integration has actually given Canada some independence it might not otherwise have had. And one thing we can point to is the fact that there was no economic retaliation against Canada when Canada did not choose to join the American misadventure in Iraq. The strength of our economy, the importance of our economy in some ways insulates us. And yet, more recent experience, I think, is less hopeful and suggests we must keep our eye on the power of economics and trade to shape our interests. President Trump was more than willing than any of his predecessors to bundle economic and trade concessions with foreign policy demands. And if there's ever another president, slightly better organized, who brings this same idea to bear, it will mean trouble for Canada. On the other side of the world, Canada relies enormously on trade with the People's Republic of China, which presents a whole host of concerns, and there's no easy solution. At the same time, we see how the market for critical minerals is placing Canada squarely in the geopolitical crosshairs of today and the future. My point, it's a broad one, is that economics have always been intertwined with Canadian national security, and there's no reason to expect that to change. In fact, it might become even more important. How have Canadians managed this in the past? Is the past worth emulating here? Now, I'm halfway through my list of baskets, so I have to pause here for those non-historians or those of you who don't have historians in your life and acknowledge that you might be tempted to argue my examples are too old and just don't apply today. You might say, the world is different now. Just think about how technology has shaped our existence. Aha, but technological change is my third example. Shifts in technology have been shaping Canada's opportunities and the challenges opposed to Canada from the very beginning. And let me just give you two examples from sort of opposite ends of the spectrum: railroads and nuclear missiles. Okay. The development of railroads made tangible the intangible idea of Canada. And I just don't mean the celebration of the last spike or any of Gordon Lightfoot's songs, right? I mean the fact that the railroads were built to link the people and the markets of the provinces of Canada along an east-west axis rather than face the inevitable draw southward. And as one of Prime Minister John A. Macdonald's biographers put it, the railways were built to achieve a separate political existence from the United States on the North American continent. Railways, once upon a time, were a new technology harnessed to unite Canada and strengthen its national security against American encroachment. Today, we frequently focus on disruptive technologies, and that's extremely important. But we must not forget how technology has been and might be used to bind and to strengthen. Now, nuclear weapons have also shaped how Canadians think about national security in a whole host of ways. I mean, the most obvious, of course, is that it did away, the ability of these missiles to travel the distance they did away with this idea that Canada's oceans were moats to forever protect our country. But another equally important effect of these weapons was the need to closely combine US and Canadian defense, and especially air defense efforts. And occasionally we read in the news today an idea that a change in United States politics might result in Canada having to go it alone on the world stage. But I think the opposite is more likely. What Canada's Cold War diplomats, those who negotiated the nuclear agreements with the United States, understood was that the real challenge to Canadian sovereignty could come from an American insistence that the United States must defend itself by defending Canada. And this has not changed. Our countries are inextricably linked when it comes to defense. I think that climate change will only make Canadian territory more important to others than it has been in the past. Now, my fourth and final category seems obvious, and perhaps it is war. The fundamental lesson of the world wars was that conflicts like these pose an existential threat to Canada. Again, this might seem straightforward, until we recall that in neither the First or Second World War was the main or the immediate threat the invasion or annexation of Canada by foreign forces. That was not what made these wars so frightening at the time. Rather, it was something equally disastrous, the lesson taken from the wars. What was witnessed in both wars was political division and the seeds of dissolution sown at home. In the First World War, and particularly around the time of the election of 1917, the political campaigns of the day were won by stirring up divisions in the Canadian body politic, and these divisions would endure for decades. The conscription crisis of the Second World War was different in its nature and its effect. Prime Minister Mackenzie King grasped this dilemma by both horns. He survived politically, and so too did Canada. But the power of war to break Canada from the inside out was so obvious that it became the very foundation of post-war Canadian foreign policy. In 1947, Secretary of State for External Affairs Louis Saint Laurent gave his famous Gray Lecture, Principles for Canadian Foreign Policy. I'll just read you the first one. The first general principle upon which I think we are agreed is that our external policies shall not destroy our unity. Now, Canada and the Canadians who make up Canada have changed significantly in the century or more since the First World War. And yet, I think it's plain to see that the possibility, really the threat of a serious global crisis or general war can pose enormous challenges for Canada and Canadians, even if the armies fighting this war are on the other side of the world. What political and societal fissures might such a crisis open in Canada, and who will exploit these gaps? The list, in my mind, is already a long one. And in a Canada riven by dissent and societal fissures, how could the government be expected? Can we expect the government to make those critical decisions that past governments have made, or will they fear political disharmony at home? Will they be paralyzed by organized political blocs organized to prevent Canada from acting? Now, Canada is not invulnerable today, but nor was it invulnerable, isolated, and protected in the past, as we often imagine. And while I don't deny the importance or even uniqueness of today's national security challenges, I do think that they fit a broader historical pattern. And if there is such a pattern in Canada's national security history, it's that for more than 150 years, the viability and integrity of Canada has been preserved first and foremost by ensuring that Canadians remain united. This history has not been easy and it has not been perfect, but we must return to it time and time again, generation after generation, with a critical and purposeful eye. We need to search this history for lessons as to how Canada met these crises in the past, so we can meet the challenges of today and those challenges we know we will face in the future. Great. Thanks very much. Good, thanks. I'll now invite Laurence to the stage.
Bonsoir à tous. Ça me fait plaisir d'être ce soir à Waterloo. Don't worry. I will switch to English. Thank you, Tim. This was a wonderful speech. And thank you, CIGI, for inviting me, and to the John Holmes trustees for making this work possible. I think this is a very inspiring way of honoring a great thinker, diplomat, educator. You will soon understand that the core element that unites my work on partisanship and national security with Tim Sayle's historical perspective is that national unity is a prerequisite to preserve our national security. Unfortunately, we have many examples of Canadians being fragmented, and this fragmentation hindering our national security. You don't have to look very far. You can turn on your TV and look at the inquiry on the Emergencies Act that's happening at the moment, and is a theater of partisan fracture, looking back at what happened with the convoy in Ottawa last year. There are many more examples of such fragmentation. We can think of the new committee that was started called NSI COP, where there was a stalemate, a new committee that takes an innovative approach on involving opposition members in reviewing national security. There was a lot of strifes on questions of redaction of documents. This might seem mundane, but is very key in questions of national security. Border management comes to mind when we think about partisan strife and national security. However, what I would like to reflect on today with you is examples when there are existential threats to our national security, and in fact, there is tremendous unity amongst political parties. I argue that reflecting on these instances of national unity is key to think of ways of nurturing this unity and of strengthening our national security. More specifically, I'd like to reflect on two examples. Canada's reaction to the invasion of Crimea by Russia in 2014 and the renegotiation of NAFTA in 2017-2018. Of course, while we focus on unity, let's recognize that we have a democratic parliamentary system for a reason, because we believe that debating, asking questions, and enabling scrutiny is what makes better policy and is what makes more transparent policies. However, extreme partisanships on issues of national security can also undermine Canadian interest. So following the invasion of Crimea by Russia in 2014, there was very little partisan division between Canadian political parties. As I was writing this essay, as part of this series, the new invasion of Ukraine was starting in March. While I don't focus specifically on this most recent invasion for questions of timeliness of when this series was produced, actually very similar trends of national security amongst Canadian political leaders and also more broadly Canadian population can be deciphered. But in a way, the reaction to the invasion of Crimea is more interesting because Canada stands out when we compare Canada to European allies, for example. In fact, European allies and European political parties took a long time to coordinate on sanctions following the invasion of Crimea. They were far from united. Some analysts now even think that this was one of Putin's miscalculation. Because it took so long for European allies to fight back following 2014, he thought, following Brexit, following a lot of other internal crises, that Europeans wouldn't be able to coordinate to support Ukraine or impose sanctions. Of course, he was misled. In the case of the United States, maybe let's look at the case of Russian interference, rather than specifically only Crimea. In fact, partisan fracture made it almost impossible to expose and oppose Russian interference in elections. So why has Canada been so united on this question, especially when we compare it to our closest allies in Europe and also in the United States? Why have Canadian political leaders generally held a realist view of Russia's global disruptive ambition? There are multiple factors we can list. The first one, when we compare to Europe, is obviously the independence from Russian energy and our economic independence. But also, I think we should note the strength of the Ukrainian-Canadian community, but also is great ability at political mobilization in time of crisis and not outside of times of crisis. And I think this has also shaped our political sphere. This has all meant that little political fractures between political parties in Canada can be exploited by Russia. But this does not mean, thankfully, probably, that there is no debate on the question of Ukraine and Russia in Canadian Parliament. In fact, when you look at question period, the topic comes up quite often. There are questions, debate, tensions on questions of aid to Ukraine, weapons export, but all of these are happening on the margin of what is broadly a consensual position. I must note, however, when we look at recent polling on Ukraine amongst Canadians, that while, as I said, there is historic, very strong political mobilization from the Ukrainian-Canadian community, when you polled all of Canadians, the vast majority agree that Canada must militarily assist Ukraine. So it is not an issue of a small community impacting. The public opinion is in favor of supporting Ukraine broadly. Let's look at another recent example of political unity amongst parties, and maybe something I lived more closely in my time in politics. I am a young retiree. Let's take a step back to 2017, 2018, to the renegotiation of NAFTA under Trump. I think we can all agree that this was by far one of the most existential Canadian foreign policy issues we faced, even though Tim might disagree because he has a bit more of a long view. But it is also a question of profound relevance to our national security. I don't have to explain it to you, you know it. If there's an economic crisis in a country, this increases a country's dependency on foreign debt. This then leads to issues of sovereignty, and economic security is recognized by all as a pillar of national security. Chinese leaders have understood the economy sovereignty nexus very well with the Belt and Road Initiative. Small countries' dependence on Chinese debt for critical infrastructure projects can likely lead to a loss of sovereignty if they're unable to repay that debt. Given that 75% of Canadian merchandise is destined to the American market, the risk of free trade being interrupted with Canada's closest ally is of real consequence to Canadian national security. We want to be trading with allies as much as possible. Not only, but as much as possible. When we look at the process of the renegotiation of NAFTA, we notice what political insiders call a real Team Canada approach. Let's be clear, this is not to be taken for granted when trade agreements are renegotiated. Some of you might remember the first NAFTA negotiation in the early 90s, which were cause for great partisan strife and political slogans. But this time around, political leaders agreed on the objective, which is preserving an open border to North American trade and without tariffs. But they also agreed on the means of achieving it, which is everyone was to be deployed to influence their counterparts in the United States and to make them understand how critical free trade with Canada is to their own economy. Some key drivers entrenched that unity. The formation of a NAFTA Council, which played a key role in feeding into the Canadian negotiation strategy. That council was composed of business, union, political figures of all stripe. So the council didn't stop at political leaders. It went to the main stakeholder groups that influenced political leaders as well. The other key factor was the formation of the delegation of premiers, MP, union leader, and other influential figures who pressured their counterparts in the United States to renew NAFTA without delay and with good conditions. When you look at most bilateral diplomatic strategies, a lot needs to be channeled through an embassy. Not everyone has a way of accessing their counterparts. But it's different with the United States. You don't need, if you're an aluminum producer, a union leader, or even someone from the arts industry, you usually don't need to always call the diplomats. You know who your counterparts are. In a way, this freedom of access and these pre-existing relationship with our neighbors bolstered the Canadian position in negotiation because everyone deployed. So why are these two examples important? They're not the only ones, but they're the two I decided to speak about today. We could surely find more. Because as Tim and I argued, unity is a prerequisite for national security. But saying this is not enough. There are ways of fostering unity. It doesn't necessarily come naturally. In fact, political tendencies sometimes lead us the other way. There needs to be proper structured channels to engage MPs, mayor, business leaders, union leaders, to name only a few examples. Relinquishing power in these existential moments of our history to engage other leaders, including those of the opposition, can be unthinkable, risky for a government in power. In fact, when we look at such examples, it might be the only way to preserve national security. Crimea and NAFTA are two examples of low partisan polarization. We can think of many examples, as some of those listed earlier, of hotbeds of partisanship. Partisanship shouldn't be eliminated. It cannot and it should not. It is part of politics. But there are lessons we can learn from these examples. Crafting a joint strategy for outreach and bilateral trade with opposition leaders and all levels of government. In the case of NSI-COP, this new model of parliamentary engagement, where members of the opposition have access almost directly to classified material, is risky, and the beginning of the experience was rocky. But if we want to preserve unity and national security, we need to constantly try to innovate, to find a model that is more inclusive. And sometimes that will mean that the beginning will be rocky, but that doesn't mean that these structures need to be thrown away. They must be polished and refined so that we can achieve our objective. Finally, we could imagine a shift in national security culture and dialogue in Canada if, for example, there was an expectation of a yearly meeting between party leaders and the Prime Minister on national security. The Prime Minister in power at the time could convene opposition leaders to have off-the-record discussion on national security priorities and approaches. You might say I'm idealistic, a little bit, but there is always a risk of instrumentalization with such processes, but new avenues need to be tested. If indeed, as my colleague Tim has already cited, former Secretary of State of External Affairs, which now seems like a little bit of a vintage title, Louis Saint-Laurent, warned in his 1947 Gray Lecture that our external policy shall not destroy our unity. I now suggest a rewrite of the quote. I think we should now warn that national discord shall not destroy our external policies. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that. Super insightful set of remarks. So we're at the Q&A portion of our discussion now, and there are microphones on both sides of the auditorium, and I do really want this to be a conversation. So if you have a question, feel free to walk up to either microphone, and we're happy to hear from you. In addition to that, to folks watching online through the magic of the internet, if you ask your question online, it'll appear on my tablet, and we want to hear from you as well. This is now a hybrid world that we're living in, and we want to make it as engaging for you as possible. So please feel free to ask questions either in the room or online as you wish. Now, I have a whole bunch of questions, and it's because your essays were really thoughtful. So I'm just going to jump right in. I want to pick up on this thread of economics and security that you both mentioned, and I think where I'd start was, if we're looking back a little bit, the end of the Cold War, fall of the Berlin Wall. We built our kind of modern society and modern international relations on two assumptions. The first was that most states were going to become democracies or were on their way to being democracies. And the second was that trade would lead to peace. And I think looking back on it now, we can probably say that both of those were wrong. And so what does that do to our lens now that we're in this world? You mentioned critical minerals. Let's talk about that. I also want to talk a little bit about the way that Canada is doing its investment review, and I want to talk about microchips. And I promise, I swear to God, there's a question in here. So Canada basically banned China from its critical minerals enterprises last Friday. Then Minister Freeland went to the Brookings Institution and gave a foreign policy speech about friendshoring, which was essentially, if I've understood it correctly, keeping adversarial states out of critical aspects of our supply chain. And then we have the American government effectively banning the most advanced microprocessors from going to China, from the know-how going to China, and from any of the machinery used to make those chips going to China. So my question to you is this. Isn't this fundamentally different? I appreciate the historic lens, but in my mind, there's something fundamentally different going on here. So maybe I'll go to you first, Tim, and then over to Laurence.
Yeah, it's a fabulous set of issues you've raised and questions. And I think that you're right, there's something new here, there's a change, but there's something sort of classic or traditional here too. I guess broadly what I would say is that I don't want to blame national security practitioners here, but maybe I'll focus just on academics who have studied national security issues to include foreign and defense policy. For so long, studies of these subjects separated politics and economics into different realms. But as anyone who's worked in the political realm knows, these things aren't divisible. It is voters who elect parties who shape these policies, and voters vote in large part in relationship to their everyday life, and a very big part of their life is how much money they make, whether they can eat, whether they can support their family. So I think we're finally getting somewhere on the academic side in recognizing that economics, politics, and security are all linked. And of course, there are scholars who have linked them before, but I think we're finally opening the aperture of what it means to study national security, and I think that's really important. But on the more direct issue of sort of Canadian policy today, I think what we've seen is, I think some people might suggest that Canada has been a little bit slow here, but I don't fault Canada for being slow, because surely it would be preferable if by trading people you could convince them that their lives could be different, that their politics could be different, their policies could be more like us. That's a really attractive proposition, right? That trade could lead to change and peace. And I think now, unfortunately, we have enough data points to know that's not true. That states will take advantage of economic conditions in a way that suits them and doesn't necessarily cause them to change in the way we want them to change. So it seems like we're finally getting there, both Canada and its allies, sort of a sad maturity as to the fact that this hope that trade liberalization could lead to political liberalization is not the case. So let me hand it over to Laurence, who probably has more to say on this, but it's a great way to start.
Well, I'll make a comment related to trade and peace, and one quickly on the issue of exporting critical technology to countries who are not allies. On trade and peace, there is no clear linkage, as you noted. But in certain cases, it's hard to justify open borders to trade without justifying, not completely open, but more open borders to people. You cannot, or exchanges, education, opportunities between countries that have strong trade ties. In this case, while it might not lead to peace, in many cases, it has led to stronger people-to-people ties. And you can think that there is a lot of countries where we consider that by and large, these are competitors in many spheres of our foreign policies, but we have extremely strong people-to-people ties. So maybe this is the silver lining. We might not have, it's not a magic bullet, but it's better than embargo in some cases, that historically, little by little, it does, because you need experts and business leaders traveling at some point. You need exchanges. And through these people growing up knowing each other, maybe there's not a big IR theory behind what I'm saying, but there's a human who's optimistic. My second point is, I think on the issue of critical technology exports, let's take a step back and think about how government think about that. Typically, we have export regimes that used to say things like, we have an agreement with this country, where the Wassenaar agreement means, I'm going to look at some former colleagues in the public service who have dealt with this a lot, means we can export weapons to NATO allies or France and so on. But then there's always a clause on dual use. a lot of technology that can be used for science, even chemicals, even microchip can be used now in things that can be used for warfare, interference, disruption, all of that. So I think it's more challenging now to think about what a country can export, because how is it used? Is this enterprise state-owned? What are the linkages? This becomes more and more of a challenge. So I don't think that this issue of not wanting to export certain critical technology is new, but the dual and multiple use aspect of certain technology makes it more complex and makes the analysis less about what the technology is than hypotheses on how it might be used.
Yeah, no, that's very fair, and I think you're absolutely right. What's complicating this is, the nature that even much of the technology we're talking about is dual use. You can use it, like artificial intelligence, right, is a good example. The best kits developed in the private sector, but certainly can be used in military applications as well. I wanted to pick up on something that you were talking about, Laurence, and Tim, you had some of this too, about political division and this pattern of ensuring that Canadians remain united. I want to be clear, I wholeheartedly agree with that. The part that I get a little bit concerned with is the how, and here's what I mean by that. Much of our public and civic discourse is now mediated by large technology platforms. I don't think that's up for debate, and those platforms make money by virtue of the fact that there's eyeballs on the platforms. What they've also figured out is that if you're looking at content that you agree with, or content that makes you mad, you'll stay on the platform longer. You will be more engaged. And therefore, we have algorithms pushing content to people where your vision of society is unique. It's micro-targeted. You're seeing the bubble. And the bubble is often reflecting your views and can even be pushing you to more extreme positions in those views. So I guess my question is, knowing that I fully support the premise, my question is, how do we get there? How do we maintain this social unity, this kind of, trying to drop the political divisions wherever we can, knowing that our society is now intermediated by companies that feed off this stuff? Laurence, could I start with you on that one?
Well, I think there's two ends of the this information supply chain, right? There's the supply and the demand. On the supply of content, we'll never be able to control all content, but I think there's interesting legislation that's being tabled and worked on to have greater regulation on content. And I think we have ways of limiting, for example, we don't have super PACs in Canada because we have laws about that. If the main issue in politics in Canada is not super PAC, then it's that kind of interference and information, and then we gotta innovate. And in the same way, we kind of crack the political funding issue in Canada. We can crack on. We can innovate. Thinkers, academic. It doesn't necessarily need to come only from the public service or the political class. I think we need to always be on our toes on how to protect our democracy. So that's the supply side. And on the demand side, I think Tim and I work in universities for a reason. We believe that we're educating, we're mentoring a generation of young Canadians and Québécois, in my case, who learn to sort out this content. And yes, part of it is idealistic, but if we can't be idealists as educator, I don't know who can. So we got to believe that the strongest tool we have is education.
Yeah, thank you. Tim, please.
I think that makes a lot of sense. A very noble answer, and it's better than me, which I was going to say I became a historian not to answer these forward-looking questions. But I will take a shot because I am concerned about the fragmentation, and Aaron mentioned fragmentation of our news sources. That's true, but I think we can see this in so many other parts of our world. We don't watch the same TV shows, right? We don't even watch the same TV shows in our household anymore. We all have our own Netflix accounts or Disney Plus or whatever it is. We see it in our curriculum with families and communities directly shaping what students are taught in sort of local and unique levels. So fragmentation is real. It's a real issue, and I don't have an easy solution. I really like Laurence's solution that that education is a part of the answer, and I agree with that. But I wasn't going to take it all on my shoulders. I was going to make an argument that, this is how great leaders come to be great leaders. We need people in Canada to stand up and unite people, to talk about what makes Canada, Canada, to make sure that we all see the benefit of being on the same page, at least to enough extent that we can keep our country together and keep it strong. So, we're at a moment, and this isn't about politics and personal political leaders or parties at the moment. I mean this really generally. We need people entering political life who are committed to the idea of service and the idea of Canada. And I just hope that maybe some of our students can be those people. But we need people to rise above. And it's not about taking away the fragmentation, right? It's not about limiting what people can do. But it's about adding something onto that, letting people know that they are a part of something bigger, and I think that thing should be Canada.
Yeah.
But to that point, if we don't, and I'm not saying you're saying the opposite, but it's really hard to convince young women to go into politics now because they're going to face the hate online, minorities, anyone. So if we want to convince people to go into politics, we got to have an environment where they know they're not going to be facing threats.
Yes.
So.
Yes, I agree.
I want to come back to that because I think that is of fundamental importance, and I actually think it dovetails with the question that I asked you both about this information landscape, because it pushes people to extremes, and then you end up with absolute nonsense. And I will say, it's different for male politicians in this country than it is for women politicians, and I know plenty of MPs, believe me, and there's concerns about security. And why in God's name would you go into politics if you're going to have to deal with this? So we have to get the civic discourse right, and it's that is you want to talk about Team Canada? That is a Team Canada issue. Well, so maybe this actually goes to the question of how do we bring people together? What is the thing that can unite us? And I wanted to ask maybe a pointed question about Ukraine, because you're starting to see fractures in the United States around the political culture of supporting Ukraine. Those discussions are probably going to get more pointed as if the economy gets worse. How do you think that Canada could position itself to support the Ukraine, knowing that Vladimir Putin launched an aggressive war and is a war criminal? What can this country do, knowing that if things continue the way they are in the United States, there might be some tensions there? Maybe on this one, Tim, could I start with you?
Sure, yeah, it's a really important question. These fractures over support for the war in Ukraine were going to come, they will come, and they will get worse. There's been a number of points in the war where I was worried that these fractures would come earlier, because possibly Russia would take some action that would expand the war, escalate the war, and lead to serious disagreement in NATO and within NATO countries. So the possibility of fracture has always been very, very real. I don't think we've seen anything yet. Depending on the course of the war, there's real chance for this fracture, both because people will take advantage of the war as a tool for their own political agenda, but because there may come to be real difficult strategic questions for those supporting Ukraine, just based on how the Russians act and how the war goes. So we need to prepare for that. Let me point to Canadian history. There are examples for how governments of Canada have managed conflicts in the past in a way that built public support. And the example I'm thinking about here is 1999 and the bombing of Serbia to prevent the genocide of the Kosovars. And there were regular press briefings from what was then Foreign Affairs and International Trade that laid out Canadian policy, that laid out how many sorties Canadian fighters were flying, and laid out the policy of the war. It was a public education effort. And I think that all NATO allies, not just Canada, need to ramp up their civic engagement and public education campaign regarding this war, because this war is no joke. This has the potential to get even more serious, and it obviously already is for Ukrainians. So the war is so important, I worry that politicians have jumped to the end point of the speech by saying this is a war of democracy versus tyranny, without filling in the blanks, explaining at maybe a more granular level all of the problems presented by this war and all the possible problems for Canada. So I would suggest that, it's never too late, so let's start a really concerted public engagement and civic education program to explain why Canadian policy is the way it is and why it's so important for Canadians.
Laurence, we actually have questions coming in from the virtual audience. So can I pivot real quick with one for you?
Sure, yeah, I've talked lots about Ukraine, so it's okay.
So John Tennant asks, many Canadians still center on Canada as a middle power. This is clearly passé. How does Canada deal with a world of hard power, a U.S. led by Trump, wolf warrior China, Putin?
I don't see middle power as a concept that is neither hard nor soft. I see middle power as what Canada is. In the G7, in the G20, at NATO, and all these big fora, but not the biggest guy at the table. It's a factor not of policy as much as historical context following the Second World War, geography, demography. Canada as a power doesn't have to be a hard power, a soft power. It has all these tools at its disposal. When using them, what being a middle power means is we can only do it with allies. And everyone should act like that, but Canada has to because of its historical posture and because it doesn't have the military or other tools to do it. But in fact, if Canada does it well, it is the biggest speech of support for diplomacy, because Canada can lead in showing how diplomacy is done, because it depends on diplomacy and because the world needs to see more how diplomacy is done. I'll just share something more personal. Canada ran for a Security Council seat not too long ago, non-permanent. Canada didn't get it. And I think it doesn't matter. It's totally worth it that Canada did this, because there was something humbling about meeting in a way, a lot of people in the system knew the likelihood was low. And in addition, competing against Ireland and Norway is in the system. Why do we do that? Not Canada, but in what this group at the UN we call the WEOG. Most other group just say, okay, this is you, then you, then you. Maybe it's more pragmatic. Anyways, we like to compete. It is the way it is. But the exercise of having to sit, not just with your G7 people and your NATO people, but with everyone, this obligatory listening tour, I think is really good for Canadian diplomacy. Now, once you do the listening tour, you gotta take this in and act on it. But I think it was right to take it to the end, even if it meant a loss, because it's a very healthy exercise for Canadian diplomacy. And this is what a middle power must do, is do a lot of listening tours and find ways of bridging.
Well, that's actually a great point of departure. I'm going to call my colleague Adam Chapnick up in a moment to close the evening with us. But I want to leave on that thought that we can lead on diplomacy, and it's somewhat fitting that we're having this conversation, because in order to lead on diplomacy, we need the best diplomats. And I will say this, I put this essay series together with Adam to honor John Holmes, but when we took it on, I never met John. And the more I dug into the essay series, the more I spoke to the people around him, the clearer it was to me that he was an absolutely exceptional person and one of the most skilled diplomats of a generation. And I think if we look back at our history and we all work hard and redouble our efforts, what we achieved in our history hopefully will be what we can achieve in our future. So thank you, Adam. You want to come up and close us out?
And I want to thank our speakers for a wonderful conversation and say that the one thing I think Mr. Holmes would have brought up in terms of what do you do about national unity, I think that his callstone was empathy. His prone, if he was asked, what do you think of this issue? He was prone to say, well, on the one side, there's this. And on the other side, there's that. And everyone would leave believing that he supported what you believed. Because everybody would leave the conversation happy, they were actually able to speak to each other afterwards and get down to business. And I think empathy is one of the tools that Mr. Holmes would have wanted us to take away from a conversation like this as we go forward in what is a very difficult world. So I thank the speakers. I thank CIGI for putting this on for us. For all of you who came, for you online, thanks so much. Let's continue to support Canada and learn about these issues and talk about them in a civilized manner. Have a good evening, everyone.